The fire had been burning for 3 days when Alara first understood what it meant to be nothing. The smoke rose black and thick from the eastern quarter of the village, carrying with it the screams of those who had not escaped quickly enough, and she had stood at the window of the orphanage watching the flames devour everything she had ever known. She was 7 years old. The matrons had pulled her away from the glass, their hands rough on her small shoulders, their voices sharp with fear and something else, something that sounded like blame. They had whispered about her mother then, about the woman who had died bringing Alara into this world, about the curse that followed silver-haired children, about the bad luck that clung to Omegas born under a new moon. Alara had not understood all of it, but she had understood enough. She had understood that she was unwanted. She had understood that even the orphanage, with its cold stone walls and thin gruel and endless labor, kept her only because the law required it. She had understood that when she looked into the eyes of the women who fed her and clothed her and put her to work in the kitchens before dawn, she saw nothing but resentment. The kingdom of Astralis was ancient and unforgiving. Its mountains rose like broken teeth against the northern sky, its forests thick and dark with old magic, its villages scattered across the valleys like seeds thrown carelessly into rocky soil. The capital city of Solmir gleamed in the distance, visible from the high ridge above Ilara's village on clear days. Its white towers and golden domes, a cruel reminder of everything that existed beyond the reach of girls like her. Astralis was ruled by hierarchy, by blood, by the iron law of alpha dominance that had governed the kingdom for 1,000 years. Alphas held the power, owned the land, commanded the armies, made the laws. Betas served them, worked the fields, filled the ranks of the common folk, lived and died in comfortable obscurity. And Omegas existed at the bottom, their purpose singular and absolute, their value measured only in their ability to bear strong children and submit to the will of their alphas. It was a world that had no room for gentleness, no patience for weakness, no mercy for those who could not fight their way to something better. Alara had grown up knowing this truth in her bones. The orphanage had made sure of it. Headmistress Corva, a severe beta woman with iron-gray hair and hands like talons, had ruled over the 43 children in her care with a discipline that bordered on cruelty. Alara had learned early to keep her head down, to speak only when spoken to move through the halls like a ghost. The other children had mocked her for her silver hair, for her small stature, for the way she flinched when voices were raised. They had called her cursed, touched by death, marked by misfortune. And perhaps they had been right. Her mother had died in childbirth, her father unknown, disappeared before Alara had drawn her first breath. She had no family, no name beyond the one the orphanage had given her, no future except the one prescribed by her designation. When she had presented as an Omega at 13, Headmistress Corva had looked at her with something almost like satisfaction, as though Alara's fate had been confirmed in the most predictable way possible. The work had intensified after that. Omegas in the orphanage were trained for service, their days filled with cooking and cleaning and mending, their education limited to the basics of reading and arithmetic, their value measured only in their obedience and their ability to perform domestic tasks without complaint. Alara had scrubbed floors until her hands bled, washed linens in water so cold it turned her fingers blue, hauled buckets of water from the well in the courtyard until her back ached and her shoulders burned. She had done it all in silence, knowing that to protest was to invite punishment, knowing that Headmistress Corva kept a thin willow switch in her office and was not afraid to use it. The scars on Alara's back were testament to that, thin white lines that had faded over the years but never quite disappeared, permanent reminders of the times she had been too slow, too clumsy, too visible. At 15, she had been apprenticed to old Marin, the village herbalist, a bent and weathered Omega woman who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of the forest. It had been Headmistress Corva's idea, a way to ensure that Alara would have some skill to offer when she was eventually claimed by an alpha, some use beyond her body and her silence. Alara had expected more of the same, more harsh words and cruel hands, more lessons taught through pain and humiliation. But Marin had been different. Maren had looked at her with eyes that saw something other than a burden, something other than a curse. Maren had taught her the names of plants, the properties of roots and flowers and barks, the way to brew tinctures and salves and teas that could ease pain or bring sleep or fight infection. Maren had taught her patience and precision, had shown her how to observe the world with careful attention, how to listen to what the forest itself was saying. For 3 years, Alara had walked the path between the orphanage and Maren's cottage, spending her days learning a craft that felt almost like magic, feeling for the first time that she might have some small purpose in this world beyond simply surviving it. But Maren had died last winter. Her body found frozen in her bed one morning when Alara had arrived to begin the day's work. The cottage had been given to another family, Maren's few possessions distributed among the villagers, her knowledge buried with her except for what she had managed to pass on to Alara. And Alara had been sent back to the orphanage, too old now to stay but with nowhere else to go, existing in a strange limbo as she waited for whatever came next. She worked in the village when there was work to be had, helping the baker's wife knead dough, assisting the weaver with her loom, earning just enough coin to pay headmistress Corva for a bed and 2 meals a day. She kept her head down and her mouth shut and tried not to think about the future, about the claiming ceremony that loomed ahead of her like an executioner's block. The ceremony was tradition, law, the cornerstone of Astrilis society. Once a year, all unmated Omegas who had reached their 18th year were brought to the capital, to the Grand Claiming Hall in the heart of Solmir, where alphas from across the kingdom gathered to choose their mates. It was supposed to be an honor, a celebration, the moment when an Omega's true purpose was revealed and fulfilled. But Alara knew better. She had heard the stories from the older women in the village, had seen the fear in their eyes when they spoke of it, had understood that for many Omegas the ceremony was not a beginning but an ending, the moment when they ceased to be people and became property. Some alphas were kind, or at least not cruel. Some marriages were tolerable, even happy, but there were no guarantees, no protections, no way for an Omega to refuse once she had been claimed. The law was absolute. The Alpha's word was final. Alara's 18th birthday had come and gone 3 weeks ago, marked by nothing except a small honey cake that one of the kitchen girls had smuggled to her room. The summons had arrived 2 days later, an official letter bearing the royal seal, informing her that she was required to present herself at the palace in Solmera on the 15th day of the 9th month for the annual claiming ceremony. Failure to appear would result in arrest and forced participation. There was no choice, no escape, no alternative. She had read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, her stomach churning, and then she had folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her few possessions. She had not cried. She had learned long ago that crying changed nothing. The journey to Solmir took 2 days by wagon, the village's unmated Omegas transported together under the supervision of a royal guard who spoke to them as though they were livestock being driven to market. There were 6 of them in total, ranging in age from 18 to 21, all of them silent and pale with anxiety. Alara sat in the back of the wagon with her small bag clutched in her lap, watching the familiar landscape of her village disappear behind them, replaced gradually by wider roads and larger towns, and finally by the sprawling metropolis of the capital itself. Solmir was overwhelming, a riot of noise and color and movement that made her head spin, its streets packed with people and horses and vendors selling everything from roasted meat to bolts of silk, to charms promising good fortune and fertility. The palace rose above it all like a mountain of white stone and gold, its towers piercing the sky, its walls thick and impenetrable, its gates guarded by soldiers in gleaming armor who watched the wagon pass with expressions of bored indifference. They were taken to the Omega quarters, a wing of the palace reserved for unmated Omegas during the ceremony. Their rooms small but clean, their meals provided, their every movement monitored by beta attendants who made it clear that they were guests only in the most technical sense. Alara was given a room with 2 other girls, neither of whom she knew, both of whom spent the evening alternating between nervous chatter and terrified silence. She lay awake that night on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about what the next day would bring. trying not to imagine the hall full of alphas, their eyes assessing and cold, their decisions made based on criteria she could only guess at. Beauty, certainly. Youth, the shape of hips and breasts, the scent of an Omega's designation, the promise of healthy children. She had none of the qualities that alphas prized. She was small and thin, her body showing the effects of years of poor nutrition and hard labor. Her silver hair was unusual but not beautiful, more often seen as a mark of ill fortune than anything else. She had no family name to recommend her, no connections, no dowry. She was nobody, nothing, invisible. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and cold. The attendants came early, waking the Omegas with sharp voices and impatient hands, ushering them into baths and then into dressing rooms where they were given formal gowns to wear, simple but elegant, designed to display them to their best advantage. Alara's gown was pale blue, the color washing her out even further, making her look like a ghost draped in silk. Her hair was brushed until it shone, left loose down her back because one of the attendants said it was her only notable feature. She was given no jewelry, no adornment, nothing to distinguish her from the dozens of other Omegas who would stand beside her in the hall. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw exactly what she had always seen. A girl who did not matter, a girl who would not be chosen, a girl whose only hope was that she might be overlooked entirely and allowed to return home to her small, quiet existence. The claiming hall was even more magnificent than she had imagined, and infinitely more terrifying. It was a vast space, its ceiling soaring overhead, supported by columns carved with scenes from Astralis history, its walls hung with banners bearing the crests of noble houses, its floor polished marble that reflected the light from hundreds of chandeliers. At one end of the hall stood a raised dais where the royal family would sit. The throne itself, a massive construction of dark wood and gold, empty now, but waiting. Along the sides of the hall were seats for the alphas, already beginning to fill with men in fine clothes, their expressions ranging from eager to bored to calculating. And in the center of the floor, arranged in neat rows, were the Omegas, 73 girls standing silent and still, their hands clasped in front of them, their eyes downcast, their fear palpable in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. Alara took her place near the back, grateful for the relative obscurity, trying to make herself even smaller than she already was. The girl beside her was trembling so hard that Alara could feel it, and she reached out without thinking, brushing her fingers against the girl's wrist in a gesture that was meant to be comforting. The girl flinched away, her eyes wide with panic, and Alara withdrew her hand quickly, folding it back with the other, retreating once again into the safety of invisibility. Music began to play, a formal processional that signaled the beginning of the ceremony, and the alphas rose from their seats as the royal family entered the hall. Alara kept her eyes on the floor, but she could hear the rustle of fabric, the weight of footsteps, the low murmur of voices as the king and his court took their places on the dais. King Aldrich Thorne was 26 years old and already a legend. He had taken the throne at 18 after the deaths of his parents and younger sister in a fire that many suspected had been deliberately set, an act of betrayal by someone within the palace itself. The perpetrators had never been found. The investigation closed without resolution, and Aldrich had ascended to power under a cloud of grief and suspicion that had never quite lifted. He had spent the past 8 years consolidating his rule, crushing rebellions, forging alliances, proving himself to be a king of iron will and ruthless efficiency. He was feared across the continent, respected by his enemies, obeyed without question by his subjects. He had never taken a mate, had never shown interest in marriage, had declared publicly that he had no intention of binding himself to anyone, that he needed no queen to help him rule. His court had accepted this, though there were always whispers, always speculation, always those who believed that a king without a mate was vulnerable, incomplete, a threat to the stability of the kingdom itself. Alara had heard all the stories, of course. Everyone in Astralis knew of King Aldrich, of his cold demeanor and his fierce intelligence, of the way he could silence a room with a single look, of his reputation for justice tempered with mercilessness. She had never expected to see him in person, had certainly never imagined that she would be standing in the same hall as him, breathing the same air, existing in the same space, even if only for a few hours. She did not look up when he entered, did not dare, but she felt the change in the room, the way every Omega seemed to draw in a collective breath, the way the air itself seemed to grow heavier with his presence. The ceremony began with a speech from Lord Cavil, the Master of Ceremonies, a pompous beta man who spoke at length about tradition and duty and the sacred bond between Alpha and Omega. Alara barely heard him. She was too focused on trying to control her breathing, on trying to keep her hands from shaking, on trying to prepare herself for what was coming. The claiming would happen in order of rank, the highest-ranking Alphas choosing first, their selections announced publicly, the chosen Omegas stepping forward to join their new mates. It was a process that could take hours, each Alpha given time to observe and consider, each choice met with applause and formal congratulations. And at the end of it, any Omegas who remained unclaimed would be assigned to lower-ranking Alphas by lottery, their fates decided by chance rather than preference. The first Alpha called was Lord Theron of House Ashmont, a powerful duke from the Northern Territories. He chose a tall, striking Omega with dark hair and golden eyes, a girl who moved with confidence and grace as she crossed the hall to join him. The second Alpha chose almost as quickly, and then the third. One by one, the Omegas were claimed, their numbers dwindling, the hall growing quieter as the hours passed. Alara watched it all with a growing sense of dread, knowing that her turn would never come, that she would stand here until the very end and then be handed off to whoever drew her name from a box, claimed not by choice but by obligation. It was what she had expected, what she had prepared herself for, but the reality of it was still crushing, still humiliating in a way that made her throat tight and her eyes burn. By late afternoon, only a dozen Omegas remained unclaimed, Alara among them. The hall had grown restless, the remaining Alphas less interested, the ceremony losing its formal grandeur and devolving into something that felt more like a transaction than a celebration. Lord Cavil called forward another Alpha, a baron from the southern coast, who scanned the remaining Omegas with barely concealed disappointment before finally selecting a girl who looked as though she might be sick. 2 more Omegas were chosen in quick succession, and then 3 more. And then suddenly, Alara was the only one left standing in the center of the hall, alone under the light of the chandeliers, exposed and humiliated in a way that felt like being stripped bare in front of hundreds of strangers. Lord Cavell looked at her with something like pity, though it might have been contempt, and gestured toward the side door where the unclaimed Omegas were meant to exit. The lottery would take place later, in a smaller room, without ceremony or witnesses, and Alara would be informed of her fate by letter. She took a step toward the door, her legs unsteady beneath her, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. She would not cry here, not in front of these people, not when it would change nothing. She would leave with what little dignity she had left, and she would accept whatever came next because she had no other choice. She was 3 steps from the door when a voice rang out across the hall, deep and commanding and impossible to ignore. "Stop!" Alara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. The hall fell silent, every head turning toward the dais, every eye fixed on the figure rising from the throne. King Aldrich Thorne stood tall and imposing, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his gray eyes sharp and focused, his expression unreadable. He descended the steps from the dais slowly, each footfall echoing in the sudden quiet. His gaze locked on Alara with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor. He crossed the hall in long strides, the crowd parting before him, nobles and guards and attendants all stepping back as though pushed by an invisible force. He stopped 3 feet from Alara, close enough that she could smell the leather and cedar scent of him, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw was clenched as though he were holding back words he did not want to speak. "What is your name?" His voice was low, meant only for her, though the hall was so silent that everyone could hear. Alara swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his eyes even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "Elara Winford, Your Majesty." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face, her hair, her posture, and then down to where her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned white. Something flickered in his expression, gone too quickly for her to identify, and then he turned back to face the hall, his voice rising to fill the space. "I claim this Omega as my fated mate." The words landed like a thunderclap, shock rippling through the assembled crowd, gasps and whispers erupting from every corner of the hall. Lord Cavil stammered something about protocol, about the need for the king to formally register his intent, but Aldrich silenced him with a single look. He turned back to Elara, extending his hand toward her, his expression still unreadable, but his eyes holding something that might have been a command or might have been a question. Elara stared at his hand, her mind unable to process what was happening, unable to reconcile the reality of this moment with everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the world, about what she was worth. The King of Astralis had just claimed her. The most powerful alpha in the kingdom had just declared her his mate. It was impossible, incomprehensible, a mistake that would surely be corrected the moment someone found the courage to point it out. But no one spoke. No one moved. The entire hall waited, holding its breath, and Elara understood with a clarity that cut through her shock that this was real, that this was happening, that she had one chance to respond, and that her entire future hung on what she did in the next few seconds. She placed her trembling hand in his, her fingers cold against his warmth, and felt his grip close around hers with a firmness that spoke of absolute certainty. He led her back across the hall, past the rows of stunned nobles, past the remaining alphas who stared at them with expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage, past Lord Cavil, who looked as though he might faint. They climbed the steps to the dais together, and Aldrich guided her to stand beside the throne, his hand still holding hers, his presence beside her both terrifying and strangely anchoring. Lord Cavil managed to pull himself together enough to complete the formal binding ritual, his voice shaking as he recited the ancient words that sealed an alpha's claim on his Omega, that made them mates in the eyes of the law and the kingdom. Elara spoke her responses mechanically, her voice barely above a whisper, her mind still reeling from the impossibility of it all. And when it was done, when the ritual was complete and the hall erupted in applause that sounded more shocked than celebratory, Aldrich finally released her hand and turned to address his court. "The ceremony is concluded. You are dismissed." They left immediately, Aldrich's hand at the small of her back, guiding her through a side door and into a corridor that led away from the claiming hall and deeper into the palace. Elara walked beside him in a daze, her legs moving without conscious thought, her entire body numb with shock. They passed guards who bowed as they approached, servants who pressed themselves against the walls to let them pass, nobles who stared after them with barely concealed curiosity. No one spoke. No one dared. Aldrich led her through a series of corridors and up 2 flights of stairs, finally stopping before a set of double doors carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. He pushed them open and gestured for her to enter, following her inside and closing the doors behind them with a soft click that sounded final. Absolute. The room was magnificent, larger than any space Elara had ever been in, furnished with heavy dark wood furniture and thick rugs and tapestries that depicted scenes from battles and hunts. A massive bed dominated one wall, its posts carved with the same vine patterns as the doors, its blankets deep blue and silver. Windows lined the far wall, looking out over the city and the mountains beyond, the late afternoon sun streaming through the glass and filling the room with golden light. Aldrich crossed to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher, handing one to Elara without a word. She took it gratefully, her throat dry, her hands still shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the glass. She drank deeply, the cool water grounding her, bringing her back into her body, into the reality of this moment. When she finally lowered the glass, she found Aldrich watching her, his expression still unreadable, his gray eyes intense in a way that made her feel exposed, seen in a way she had never been before. She did not know what to say, did not know what he expected from her, did not know if she was allowed to speak at all. So she stood there in silence, waiting, her heart pounding, her entire body tense with anticipation and fear. "You have questions," Aldrich said finally, his voice breaking the silence. It was not a question but a statement, an acknowledgement of the obvious. Alara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Ask them." She hesitated, trying to organize her thoughts, trying to find words for the chaos in her mind. "Why?" she managed finally, the single word inadequate but the only one she could force past her lips. "Why did you claim me?" Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving away from her to the windows, to the city beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "I felt the bond the moment you entered the hall, the pull of a fated mate. I have spent 8 years denying that such a thing could exist, believing that I would never experience it, that I was somehow immune or exempt. And then you walked in, and I knew. I knew you were mine." The words should have been romantic, should have filled her with joy or relief, or something other than the cold dread that settled in her stomach, because she understood what he was not saying, what lay beneath the surface of his admission. He had not chosen her because he wanted her, because he found her beautiful or interesting or worthy. He had chosen her because biology had demanded it, because some ancient magic had recognized her as his match, and he had been unable to resist. She was not a person to him. She was a compulsion, an obligation, a fate he had not asked for and clearly did not want. "I will not hurt you," Aldrich continued, his eyes returning to her face. "You will be treated with respect. You will want for nothing. But I will not pretend that this is something it is not. I did not want a mate. I do not want the vulnerability that comes with caring for someone, the weakness that comes with attachment. My family was taken from me because I loved them, because someone knew that hurting them would hurt me. I will not allow myself to be vulnerable in that way again. Do you understand?" Alara nodded slowly, her throat tight. She understood perfectly. She understood that she had been saved from one kind of prison only to be placed in another, that she had traded the uncertainty of the lottery for the certainty of a life beside a man who would never see her as anything more than a burden he was bound to by forces beyond his control. She understood that she was alone, that she would always be alone, that nothing had actually changed except the setting of her isolation. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Thank you for your honesty." Aldrich's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been surprise or approval flickering across his features. "You may call me Aldrich when we are alone, and you are welcome to these rooms. They are yours now, as much as they are mine. I will have your things brought from the Omega quarters. If you need anything, inform the attendants, and it will be provided. I have meetings this evening that cannot be postponed, but I will return later. We can discuss expectations then." He set his glass down on the sideboard and moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "One more thing. There will be those in this court who will see you as a weakness, a way to manipulate or control me. Trust no one until you know them well enough to judge their intentions. And if anyone threatens you or treats you with anything less than the respect due to a queen, you will inform me immediately. Is that clear?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Alara said, and then corrected herself. "Yes, Aldrich." He nodded once, satisfied, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with that same soft finality, leaving Alara alone in the beautiful empty room that was now hers, standing in a pool of golden sunlight that did nothing to warm the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Alara stood alone in the room for a long time after Aldrich left, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what had just happened. She was in the royal palace. She was the king's mate. She was going to be queen. The words felt absurd even as she thought them, like a story someone else was telling about someone else's life. Queens were powerful women from noble families, educated and refined, trained from birth for the role they would one day assume. Queens were not orphaned Omegas with silver hair and scarred backs and hands calloused from years of manual labor. Queens were not girls who had spent their lives being told they were worthless, invisible, cursed. She moved slowly through the room, touching things tentatively as though they might disappear if she pressed too hard. The bed was enormous, the mattress so thick and soft that when she sat on the edge of it she sank several inches. The blankets woven from fabric so fine it felt like water against her fingers. There was a wardrobe against one wall, its doors carved with the same intricate patterns as everything else in the room. And when she opened it, she found it already filled with clothes, gowns in every color and style, all of them clearly made for someone of her size. Had they been prepared in advance? Had Aldrich known he would claim someone today? Had he planned this despite his protestations about not wanting a mate? Or were these simply the standard provisions made for any Omega who might enter the royal household? A collection of garments kept ready for whatever eventuality might arise. She closed the wardrobe and continued her exploration, finding a sitting area with comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace, a desk with paper and ink and ceiling, wax, a door that led to a bathing room with a tub large enough for 3 people, and water that ran hot from copper pipes set into the walls. It was luxury beyond anything she had ever imagined, comfort she had never known existed, and it felt wrong, all of it, like wearing clothes that belonged to someone else, like inhabiting a space meant for a person she could never be. The attendants arrived as the sun was setting, 3 beta women in neat gray uniforms who curtsied to her and spoke in respectful tones that made her deeply uncomfortable. They brought her belongings from the Omega quarters, the pitiful collection of items that constituted everything she owned in the world. 2 changes of clothes, a worn book on herbalism that had belonged to Marin, a small wooden box containing the few coins she had managed to save, and the honey cake from her birthday, carefully wrapped in cloth, half-eaten but somehow precious. The attendants placed these items in the wardrobe with the beautiful gowns, the contrast so stark it was almost painful to see, and then they offered to help her dress for dinner, to style her hair, to prepare her for the evening ahead. Alara declined as politely as she could manage, assuring them that she could manage on her own, desperately needing them to leave so she could be alone with her thoughts. They hesitated, clearly uncertain whether they were allowed to obey her wishes, but finally they curtsied again and withdrew, promising to return in an hour to escort her to the dining hall. The moment they were gone, Alara sank into one of the chairs by the fireplace and buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with the effort of holding back the tears that had been threatening all day. She would not cry. She would not allow herself to fall apart. She had survived worse than this, had endured years of hardship and cruelty and neglect, had learned to be strong in the only way that mattered, by refusing to break no matter what was done to her. This was just another trial, another test, another situation she would have to navigate with whatever resources she had available. She thought about Aldrich's words, about his warning that there would be those in the court who would see her as a weakness. She believed him absolutely. She had been in the palace less than a day, and she could already feel the weight of hostile attention, the way people looked at her as though trying to solve a puzzle, trying to understand why the king who had sworn never to take a mate had suddenly claimed the most unremarkable Omega in the entire ceremony. They would assume she had some hidden quality, some secret skill or connection that made her valuable. And when they discovered that she had nothing, that she was exactly what she appeared to be, they would despise her for it, would see her as an insult to the institution of the crown, a stain on the dignity of the throne. She needed to be careful. She needed to be observant. She needed to learn the rules of this new world as quickly as possible, to identify who could be trusted and who posed a threat, to find a way to make herself useful so that she would not be seen as merely decorative, a pretty ornament the king had acquired on a whim. Except she was not even pretty, not in any conventional sense, so that particular role was closed to her before she even began. What did she have to offer? Her knowledge of herbs, perhaps, though she doubted anyone in the palace would care about the skills of a village herbalist, when they surely had court physicians with training far beyond anything Marin could have provided. Her ability to work hard, to endure discomfort, to survive on very little, those were the skills of the poor, not the attributes of a queen. She was still sitting there, lost in these dark thoughts, when the attendants returned to escort her to dinner. They had brought a gown for her, a simple but elegant dress in deep green with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs. and they insisted on helping her into it despite her protests. One of them brushed her hair while another fastened the tiny buttons that ran down the back of the dress, their movements efficient and practiced, their faces carefully neutral. When they were finished, they stepped back and examined her critically, making small adjustments to the fall of her hair and the drape of the fabric. And then they pronounced her ready and led her out of the room and through the maze of corridors that made up the royal wing of the palace. The dining hall was smaller than the claiming hall, but no less impressive. A long room with a table that could easily seat 50 people, though tonight only a dozen places were set, all of them near the head of the table where Aldrich already sat. He rose when Alara entered, a gesture of respect that surprised her, and gestured to the chair at his right hand. She walked the length of the room with her head high and her hands steady, refusing to let anyone see how terrified she was, and took the seat he indicated. The other diners were already present, nobles and advisors and officials whose names she did not know, their conversations dying away as she sat down, their attention turning to her with a weight that felt suffocating. Aldrich introduced her formally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, making it clear that she was to be treated as his equal, as the future queen of Astrilis. The nobles responded with the appropriate courtesies, bowing and murmuring words of welcome and congratulations, but Alara could see the calculation in their eyes, the assessment and judgment that lay beneath the polite facades. One man in particular drew her attention, seated 3 places down from Aldrich on the opposite side of the table, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He was perhaps 30, handsome in a sharp-featured way, his dark hair swept back from his forehead, his clothes rich with gold embroidery. When Aldrich introduced him as Lord Maelor Thorne, cousin to the king and advisor to the crown, Alara felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The meal was elaborate, course after course of rich food prepared with spices and techniques Alara had never encountered, served on plates of fine porcelain by servants who moved with silent efficiency. She ate sparingly, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to handle much food, and she spoke only when directly addressed, answering questions about her background with careful honesty that revealed nothing of value. She was from a village to the north. She had been apprenticed to an herbalist. She had no family. Simple facts that painted a picture of someone utterly ordinary, someone who had no business sitting at this table in this palace beside this king. The conversation around the table turned to matters of state, to reports from the provinces and disputes over taxation, and concerns about the growing unrest in the Western Territories, where a group of rebels had been attacking trade caravans and burning supply depots. Alara listened carefully, trying to understand the political landscape she had been thrust into, trying to identify the alliances and rivalries that shaped the court. It became clear very quickly that Maelor was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, second only to Aldrich himself, his influence extending into every aspect of governance, his opinion sought and valued by everyone present. It also became clear that he did not approve of Alara, though he was far too skilled a courtier to say so directly. Instead, he made subtle comments that could be taken as either compliments or insults depending on one's interpretation, observations about the unpredictability of fate and the mysterious ways in which bonds formed, remarks about the importance of maintaining the dignity of the crown, and ensuring that those who represented the kingdom were adequately prepared for the responsibility. Aldrich deflected these comments with the ease of long practice, his responses polite but firm, making it clear that the subject of his mate was not open for discussion. But Alara could feel the tension building, could sense the undercurrent of conflict that lay beneath the civilized surface of the dinner, and she understood that this was only the beginning, that Maelor had declared himself an enemy with that first subtle attack, and that she would need to be constantly vigilant if she hoped to survive in this environment. The meal finally ended, and Aldrich rose, offering his hand to help Alara from her chair. She took it gratefully, relieved to escape the scrutiny of the assembled nobles, and allowed him to lead her from the dining hall and back through the corridors to their shared rooms. Neither of them spoke until they were safely behind closed doors, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts and unasked questions. Aldrich poured himself a glass of wine from a decanter on the sideboard and stood by the window, looking out over the darkening city. Elara remained near the door, uncertain whether she was expected to stay or go, whether these rooms were truly shared, or whether she was meant to sleep elsewhere. After a long moment, Aldrich turned to face her, his expression tired in a way that made him seem more human, less like the cold and distant king who had claimed her in the hall. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said quietly. "Better than I expected, given the circumstances. Maelor will be a problem, but you already knew that." Elara nodded. "He does not think I am worthy of you. He thinks I am a mistake. He thinks everyone is a mistake except himself," Aldrich said with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes. "He has spent years positioning himself as the most logical successor should anything happen to me. My claiming a mate threatens that position, particularly a mate who might bear children, legitimate heirs who would supersede his claim to the throne entirely. He will do everything in his power to undermine you, to prove that you are unfit, to convince the court that I made an error in judgment when I chose you." "Did you?" The question escaped before Elara could stop it, and she immediately regretted it. But Aldrich did not seem offended. Instead, he considered it seriously, his gaze searching her face as though looking for something he had not yet found. "I do not know," he said finally. "The bond is real. The pull I feel toward you is undeniable. But whether that makes you the right person to stand beside me as queen, whether you have the strength and the intelligence and the will to navigate this world without being destroyed by it, that remains to be seen. I will not lie to you, Elara. This will be harder than anything you have experienced before. The court is vicious. The politics are treacherous. There are those who would kill you without hesitation if they believed it would serve their interests. I can offer you protection to a point, but ultimately, you will need to learn to protect yourself." His honesty was brutal, but somehow comforting in its clarity. He was not pretending that everything would be fine, was not offering her false reassurances or empty promises. He was treating her as an adult capable of understanding the reality of her situation, and for that she was grateful. "Then teach me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "Teach me what I need to know. I am not afraid of hard work. I am not afraid of learning. I have survived worse than hostile nobles and political scheming. I can survive this too." Aldrich studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "Very well. We will begin tomorrow. For tonight, you should rest. The bed is large enough for both of us, but if you would prefer separate sleeping arrangements, I can have another bed brought in." Elara glanced at the massive bed, at the space that seemed to stretch on forever, and shook her head. "It is fine. We can share it." She did not know what she expected from him, whether he would demand his rights as her mate, whether the bond between them would compel some immediate physical intimacy. But Aldrich simply nodded and turned away, moving to the far side of the room to change into sleeping clothes, giving her privacy to do the same. She undressed quickly, grateful for the relative darkness, and pulled on the simple nightgown the attendants had left for her. When she climbed into the bed, she stayed as far to one side as possible, her body tense, her senses hyper-aware of every sound and movement. Aldrich joined her a few minutes later, the mattress dipping under his weight, and then the room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the city beyond the windows, and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. Elara lay awake for hours, staring at the canopy above the bed, her mind racing through everything that had happened, everything that had changed, everything that lay ahead. She thought about the orphanage and headmistress Corva, and the years of being told she was worthless. She thought about Marin and the cottage in the forest, and the peaceful hours spent learning the names of plants. She thought about the claiming hall and the moment when Aldrich had risen from his throne and crossed the floor to claim her, the way his hand had felt around hers, solid and warm and absolutely certain. She thought about Maelor's cold eyes, and the danger she could sense gathering around her like storm clouds on the horizon. And she thought about Aldrich lying beside her in the darkness, close enough to touch but impossibly distant, bound to her by fate but separated by walls neither of them knew how to breach. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her anxiety, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with fragments of dreams she would not remember in the morning. She woke to pale dawn light streaming through the windows and the realization that she was alone in the bed. Aldrich already gone, his side of the mattress cold to the touch. For a moment, she felt a sharp pang of abandonment, and then she pushed it away, reminding herself that he had made no promises, that he had been clear about the limitations of their relationship, that she had no right to expect more than what he had offered. She rose and washed and dressed in one of the simpler gowns from the wardrobe, a practical gray dress that seemed appropriate for whatever the day might bring. The attendants arrived with breakfast, laying out a selection of bread and cheese and fruit on the table in the sitting area, and then they informed her that the king had requested her presence in his study at mid-morning. They offered to escort her when the time came, but Alara asked instead if they could provide her with a map of the palace, explaining that she needed to learn her way around if she was going to be living here. They seemed surprised by the request, but agreed readily enough, returning an hour later with a detailed drawing of the palace layout, marking her rooms and Aldrich's study and the major public spaces. Alara spent the intervening time studying the map, committing the corridors and staircases and courtyards to memory, understanding that knowledge of the physical space would give her a small measure of control in an environment where she had very little. When it was time to go to the study, she dismissed the attendants and navigated the route herself, pleased when she arrived at the correct door without having to ask for directions. She knocked lightly, and Aldrich's voice called for her to enter. The study was a large room lined with bookshelves, the center dominated by a heavy desk covered in papers and maps and correspondence. Aldrich sat behind the desk, reading through a document with a frown of concentration, and he looked up when Alara entered, gesturing for her to take one of the chairs opposite him. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. "I have arranged for you to meet with several people today," Aldrich said without preamble. "Lady Karen will instruct you in court protocol and etiquette. Master Davrin will brief you on the structure of the kingdom's government and the major noble houses, and Captain Roth will assess your self-defense skills and determine what training you require. These sessions will continue daily until you are adequately prepared to function in your role. Do you have any questions?" Alara shook her head. It was exactly what she had expected. A crash course in everything she needed to know to avoid embarrassing herself or Aldrich. "No questions. When do we begin?" "Lady Karen is waiting in the solar. I will take you there now, and then I have a council meeting that will occupy the rest of my morning. We will speak again this evening." He rose and led her through the palace to a bright, airy room where an older woman with silver-gray hair and sharp blue eyes waited. Lady Karen was a former lady-in-waiting to Aldrich's mother, now serving as the palace's chief protocol officer, and she greeted Alara with a brisk efficiency that was somehow reassuring in its lack of pity or condescension. Aldrich left them alone, and Lady Karen immediately launched into a detailed explanation of how the court functioned, who held what rank, what forms of address were appropriate for different situations, how formal events were conducted, what was expected of a queen in terms of public appearances and charitable work and diplomatic entertaining. It was overwhelming, a flood of information that Alara struggled to absorb, but she took notes furiously, asking questions when she did not understand, repeating things back to confirm she had them correct. Lady Karen seemed pleased by her diligence, commenting that many young women in her position would have assumed their beauty or their connection to the king was sufficient and would not have bothered to actually learn anything. Alara did not mention that she had no beauty to rely on, that she knew perfectly well that her only chance of surviving this world was to prove herself useful in some other way. The session with Master Davrin was equally intense, a rapid overview of Astralis history and political structure, explanations of the relationships between the various noble houses, warnings about which families were allied with the crown, and which harbored resentments or ambitions that might make them dangerous. He spoke at length about Maelor Thorne, confirming Aldrich's assessment that the man was the greatest threat to Alara's position, explaining that Maelor had been raised with the expectation that he would one day inherit the throne, that he had spent years cultivating support among the nobility, that he commanded significant resources and had a network of loyal followers throughout the kingdom. Master Davrin advised Alara to be cautious in all her dealings with Maelor, to assume that anything she said in his presence would be used against her, to never underestimate his intelligence or his ruthlessness. By the time she met with Captain Roth in the afternoon, Alara's head was spinning with names and dates and political alliances, and she was grateful for the shift to something physical, something that required her body rather than her mind. Captain Roth was a tall, muscular alpha woman with scars on her hands and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Alara a bit of Marin. She assessed Alara with a critical eye, asking her to demonstrate basic defensive movements, observing the way she moved and the way she carried herself. When she finished, she announced that Alara had good instincts, but no training, that she was smaller and weaker than most potential threats, but also faster and more flexible than people would expect, and that with proper instruction, she could learn to defend herself adequately against common dangers. The training began immediately, Captain Roth showing her how to break a grip, how to strike vulnerable points, how to use her small size to her advantage, how to move in ways that would make it harder for someone to control her. It was exhausting work, and by the end of the session, Alara was bruised and sweating and more tired than she had been in years. But it felt good, felt empowering, felt like taking some small measure of control over her own safety in a world that seemed designed to make her vulnerable. She returned to her rooms in the early evening, grateful to wash and change and have a few minutes of quiet before dinner. Aldrich was already there when she arrived, sitting in one of the chairs by the fireplace, reading through more correspondence, and he looked up when she entered. "How did it go?" he asked. "It was a lot," Alara admitted, sinking into the chair opposite him. "But I think I can learn it. Lady Karen says I ask good questions. Master Davrin says I have a quick mind. Captain Roth says I have potential. So I suppose that is something." Aldrich smiled slightly, the expression softening his features in a way that made him look younger, less burdened. "It is more than something. You did well today, Alara. Better than most would have done in your position." The praise warmed something in her chest, a small glow of satisfaction that she tried not to examine too closely. She did not need his approval, did not need his affection, did not need anything from him except the protection he had promised, and the space to learn and grow into this role she had been thrust into. But it felt good anyway, felt like a small victory, like proof that she was not completely hopeless after all. They had dinner together that night, just the two of them in their rooms rather than in the formal dining hall, and the conversation was easier than it had been the night before. Aldrich told her about the council meeting, about the ongoing problems in the Western Territories, about the delicate negotiations with a neighboring kingdom that was considering a trade alliance. Alara listened and asked questions, offering occasional observations drawn from her own limited experience, and was surprised when Aldrich seemed to actually consider her input, nodding thoughtfully when she suggested that the rebels in the West might be acting out of desperation rather than ideology, that addressing the underlying causes of their grievances might be more effective than simply trying to crush them through military force. "You think like a healer," Aldrich said, his tone thoughtful. "You look for the root of the problem rather than just treating the symptoms. It is not a common perspective in this court. Marin taught me that," Alara said quietly. She said that most people wanted quick solutions, easy answers, something that would make the pain stop immediately. But real healing took time and patience, and a willingness to address the underlying damage, not just the surface wounds. "Marin sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. I miss her." Aldrich was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I am sorry you lost her. I know what it is to lose someone who matters." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with grief that Alara knew she could not fully understand. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, to bridge the distance that separated them. But she did not know how, did not know if it would be welcome, did not know if she had the right. So instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging his loss, accepting the small offering of vulnerability he had given her. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and when they went to bed that night, the space between them felt fractionally smaller, the darkness fractionally less oppressive. Alara fell asleep more easily than she had the night before, her body exhausted from the day's training, her mind settling into a cautious optimism that perhaps, just perhaps, she might find a way to make this work. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely comforting. Ilara's days were divided between lessons with Lady Karen, briefings with Master Davrin, and training sessions with Captain Roth, each hour filled with new information, new skills, new challenges that pushed her far beyond anything she had thought herself capable of. She learned how to walk like a queen, how to hold herself with dignity even when she felt like collapsing, how to speak with confidence even when she had no idea what she was talking about. She learned the names of every major noble house in Astrilis and their connections to one another, the history of old feuds and recent alliances, the subtle dynamics of power that governed the court. She learned how to fall properly when thrown, how to anticipate an attack, how to use everyday objects as weapons if necessary, how to keep fighting even when her body screamed for rest. And slowly, gradually, she began to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who might actually belong here. It was not confidence exactly. Not yet. But it was the beginning of competence. The sense that she was learning fast enough to avoid the worst mistakes, that she might be able to navigate this world without bringing complete disaster down on herself and Aldrich. She made her first public appearance at a garden party hosted by Lady Vereen, one of the older noblewomen whose family had been loyal to the crown for generations, and though she was terrified the entire time, she managed to speak politely to the assembled guests, to answer their questions without revealing her ignorance, to project at least the appearance of composure. Lady Karen pronounced it an adequate first effort, which Ilara understood to be high praise from someone not given to unnecessary compliments. Aldrich was often absent, his time consumed by the demands of ruling a kingdom, but they had dinner together most evenings, and these meals became the anchor points of Ilara's days, the moments when she could speak freely and ask questions, and share the small observations she had made about the people around her. Aldrich listened with attention that surprised her, sometimes offering explanations or context, sometimes asking her opinion on matters of policy or personnel, gradually treating her less like a burden he had been forced to accept, and more like a partner whose perspective he found valuable. She could not tell if he was simply being pragmatic, recognizing that she would be more useful to him if she understood what was happening in the kingdom, or if there was something more to it, some genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. She told herself it did not matter, that she should not look for affection where none was promised, but she could not quite suppress the small warmth that bloomed in her chest when he asked for her input, or smiled at something she said. The physical distance between them remained, however, a careful space that neither crossed even as they shared the same bed each night. Aldrich was unfailingly respectful, never touching her without permission, never demanding anything beyond what she freely offered, which was mostly conversation and companionship. Ilara appreciated his restraint, even as some part of her wondered what it would be like if he did want more. If the bond between them pulled him toward her with the same intensity she sometimes felt pulling her toward him. Because she was beginning to realize, much to her dismay, that she was developing feelings for him that went beyond gratitude or respect, that she looked forward to their evenings together with an anticipation that felt dangerously close to longing, that she found herself watching him when he was not looking, noticing the way his hands moved when he spoke, the rare smile that transformed his face, the moments when the mask of the cold king slipped and she could see the man beneath. It was foolish, she knew, to care for someone who had explicitly stated that he did not want attachment, who had chosen her only because fate had forced his hand. But knowing it was foolish did not make the feelings go away, did not stop her heart from beating faster when he entered a room, did not prevent the ache that settled in her chest when she thought about spending the rest of her life beside someone who would never truly see her as anything more than an obligation. 1 month after the claiming ceremony, Aldrich announced that they would be hosting a formal diplomatic reception for the ambassador from Velantria, a neighboring kingdom with whom Astrilis had maintained an uneasy peace for decades. It would be Ilara's first major test, her first appearance at an event where she would be expected to function as queen in all but official title, and the news sent a spike of anxiety through her that lasted for days. Lady Karen intensified their training sessions, drilling Alara on diplomatic protocols and appropriate conversation topics, and the specific history of Astrilis-Vilantria relations. Master Davrin provided detailed intelligence on the ambassador and his staff, their backgrounds and allegiances and likely objectives. Captain Roth added extra training sessions focused on maintaining composure under pressure, teaching Alara techniques for controlling her breathing and her body language when she felt overwhelmed. The night of the reception arrived too quickly. Alara dressed in a gown of midnight blue that Lady Karen had selected for her, the fabric heavy with silver embroidery that caught the light when she moved, making her look almost ethereal. Her hair was styled in an elaborate arrangement that had taken one of the attendants nearly an hour to complete. Small silver pins scattered through the silver strands like stars. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Someone who appeared regal and composed and entirely unlike the frightened girl who had stood alone in the claiming hall just weeks ago. Aldrich came to collect her personally, and she saw something shift in his expression when he saw her. Something that might have been surprise or approval or something else entirely. He offered his arm and she took it, grateful for the solid presence of him beside her as they made their way to the grand reception hall where the guests were already gathering. The room was filled with nobles and officials and foreign dignitaries, all of them dressed in their finest clothes, all of them watching as Aldrich and Alara entered together. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, hundreds of eyes assessing her, judging her, looking for any sign of weakness or inadequacy. Aldrich introduced her to the Vilantrian ambassador, Lord Caston, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He greeted her with formal courtesy, his words polite, but his tone carrying an edge of skepticism, as though he were not quite convinced that she was what she appeared to be. Alara responded with equal courtesy, drawing on everything Lady Karen had taught her, keeping her voice steady and her posture perfect, refusing to let him see how nervous she was. They spoke for several minutes about neutral topics, the weather and the journey from Vilantria and the beauty of the palace gardens, and then Lord Caston moved on to speak with other guests, leaving Alara with the sense that she had passed some initial test, but that he would be watching her carefully for the rest of the evening. The reception continued for hours, a carefully choreographed dance of diplomatic pleasantries and veiled negotiations. Alara circulated through the room on Aldrich's arm, meeting nobles she had only heard about, conversing with foreign dignitaries whose names she struggled to remember, maintaining the facade of calm confidence even as her feet ached in the elegant shoes and her face hurt from smiling. She was introduced to Maelor again, who greeted her with poisonous courtesy, his words technically appropriate but laden with subtle insults that only she seemed to notice. He commented on how quickly she had adapted to court life, implying that perhaps she had more experience with such environments than her background suggested. He remarked on the unconventional nature of her claiming, suggesting that fate sometimes acted in mysterious ways that defied logic or precedent. He inquired about her family, knowing full well that she had none, forcing her to acknowledge her lack of connections in front of a group of nobles who clearly found her origins distasteful. Aldrich deflected these attacks when he heard them, his responses cutting and precise. But he could not be everywhere at once, and Alara found herself increasingly isolated as the evening wore on, standing on the periphery of conversations, watching groups of nobles who fell silent when she approached, sensing the hostility that simmered beneath the polite surfaces. She endured it with the same stoic patience she had learned in the orphanage, refusing to let them see that their rejection hurt, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her fail. She was standing alone near one of the tall windows, taking a brief respite from the endless socializing when a woman approached her. She was perhaps 40, elegantly dressed in deep purple, her dark hair threaded with gray, her expression open and kind in a way that was rare in this court. She introduced herself as Lady Sanna, widow of Lord Heron, who had died serving in Aldrich's military campaigns 3 years ago. And she spoke to Alara not with the careful distance of the other nobles, but with genuine warmth, asking how she was adjusting to palace life, whether she had everything she needed, if there was anything she could do to help. Alara responded cautiously at first, wary of another trap, another test designed to reveal her inadequacy. But Lady Sanna seemed sincere, and as they spoke, Alara found herself relaxing slightly, grateful for the first real kindness she had been shown by anyone in the court besides Aldrich's instructors. Lady Sana spoke about her own experience entering court life as the young wife of a military officer, the challenges of learning to navigate the complex social hierarchies, the loneliness of feeling like an outsider in a world where everyone else seemed to know the rules. She offered practical advice about which nobles could be trusted and which should be avoided, about how to build alliances without appearing calculating, about the importance of finding at least a few genuine friends in a place where most relationships were transactional. "You have made an enemy of Maelor," Lady Sana said quietly, her eyes moving briefly to where Maelor stood across the room, deep in conversation with a group of younger nobles. "That was inevitable given the circumstances. But you should know that not everyone agrees with him, that there are those of us who believe the king made the right choice, that the bond of fated mates is not something to be questioned or dismissed. You are not as alone as you might think." The words brought unexpected tears to Alara's eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, not wanting to embarrass herself. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." "We should speak again," Lady Sana said. "Perhaps you could join me for tea sometime this week. I would enjoy the opportunity to get to know you better, away from all of this." She gestured vaguely at the crowded room, the elaborate pretense of the diplomatic reception. Alara agreed readily, sensing that she had just found the ally Master Davrin had told her she would need, someone who could help her understand the court from an insider's perspective, who might actually want to see her succeed rather than fail. They exchanged a few more pleasantries, and then Lady Sana moved on, leaving Alara feeling fractionally less alone than she had minutes before. The reception finally ended near midnight, the guests departing in groups, their carriages called and their servants summoned. Alara stood beside Aldrich as they bid farewell to Lord Castan and his delegation, maintaining her composure until the last guest had left and they were finally alone in the empty hall. Only then did she allow herself to sag slightly, the exhaustion of the evening catching up with her all at once. "You did well," Aldrich said, his voice quiet in the sudden silence. "Better than well. You handled Maelor with grace, and you made a favorable impression on Lord Castan, which is no small feat. I heard from several people that they were impressed by you. I also heard from several people that they think I am completely unsuitable and that you have made a terrible mistake," Alara said, too tired to filter her words. "I heard the whispers when they thought I could not hear. I saw the looks. I know what they think of me. What they think does not matter," Aldrich said firmly. "What matters is that you are learning, that you are growing into this role, that you are proving yourself capable despite everyone's expectations. Let them whisper. Let them doubt. You will prove them wrong." Alara wanted to believe him, wanted to take comfort in his confidence, but she could not quite shake the sense of inadequacy that had been growing all evening. The feeling that she was playing a role she was not equipped to play, that eventually everyone would see through the facade and recognize her for what she truly was. "What if I cannot?" she asked quietly. "What if I am not strong enough for this? What if I fail you?" Aldrich turned to face her fully, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You survived 18 years of hardship that would have broken most people. You endured cruelty and neglect and abuse. And you are still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give up. That is strength, Alara. That is the kind of strength that matters. Everything else you can learn." He reached out and took her hand, the first time he had initiated physical contact between them, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. The touch sent a shock through her system, the bond between them flaring to life in a way that made her acutely aware of his presence, of the scant inches that separated them, of the way his scent surrounded her like a physical thing. She saw her own reaction mirrored in his eyes, saw the way his pupils dilated slightly, the way his breathing changed, the evidence that he felt the pull as strongly as she did. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, might close that final distance and claim her in a way that went beyond the formal binding of the ceremony. But then he released her hand and stepped back, the moment passing, the distance reasserting itself. "You should rest," he said, his voice rougher than it had been moments before. "Tomorrow will be another long day." They walked back to their rooms in silence, and when they went to bed that night, Alara lay awake for hours, her hand still tingling from his touch, her body humming with a wanting she did not quite know how to name. She told herself it was just the bond, just biology, just the natural pull between fated mates that had nothing to do with genuine feeling or real connection. But deep down, she knew it was more than that, knew that she was falling for him in a way that had nothing to do with fate and everything to do with who he was, the man behind the crown, the person she saw in their quiet evening conversations, the unexpected gentleness that he showed her when no one else was watching. The tea with Lady Santa took place 3 days later in a small sitting room in the residential wing of the palace. It was an informal gathering, just the two of them, and Alara found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did in the palace, speaking more freely than she usually allowed herself to. Lady Santa asked about her background, and Alara found herself telling stories she had never shared with anyone, about Marin and the years spent learning herbalism, about the beauty of the forest at dawn, about the satisfaction of creating something that could heal. Lady Santa listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly paying attention, and then she shared her own stories, about her late husband and her 2 sons who now served in the military, about the challenges of raising children alone after losing her mate, about the loneliness that never quite went away even years later. The bond between fated mates is powerful, Lady Santa said at one point, her expression thoughtful. But it is not automatic happiness, not guaranteed love. It creates potential, creates the possibility of something extraordinary, but it still requires work, requires both people to choose each other beyond what fate has decreed. My husband and I were fated mates, and we had a good marriage, but we also had to learn how to communicate, how to support each other, how to be partners rather than just 2 people bound by biology. It took time, took effort, took a willingness to be vulnerable even when it was frightening. Aldrich has made it very clear that he does not want vulnerability, Alara said quietly. He does not want attachment. He claimed me because the bond demanded it, but he has no interest in anything beyond that. Are you certain? Lady Santa asked gently. Because from what I have observed, the king looks at you differently than he looks at anyone else. There is a softness in his expression when he speaks to you that I have never seen in all the years I have known him. It is subtle, easily missed if you are not looking for it, but it is there. I think he cares for you more than he is willing to admit, even to himself. Alara wanted desperately to believe that, wanted to think that maybe the distance between them was not insurmountable, that maybe there was hope for something real to develop between them. But she was afraid to hope, afraid of the disappointment that would come if she allowed herself to want more, and then discovered that Lady Santa was wrong, that Aldrich's feelings did not extend beyond duty and obligation. I do not know how to reach him, she admitted. I do not know how to break through the walls he has built around himself, and I am not sure I have the right to try. You have every right, Lady Santa said firmly. You are his mate. You are the person fate chose to stand beside him. That gives you rights and privileges that no one else can claim, regardless of what the court thinks or says. If you want more from this relationship, if you want him to truly see you and value you as more than just an obligation, then you need to be willing to fight for it. You need to show him that vulnerability is not weakness, that caring for someone does not make him less strong, but more complete. The conversation stayed with Alara for days afterward, replaying in her mind during her training sessions and her lessons and the quiet moments before sleep. She thought about what it would mean to fight for Aldrich's affection, to actively pursue a deeper connection rather than simply accepting the limitations he had established. It felt terrifying, the risk of rejection enormous, the potential for humiliation vast. But it also felt like the only path forward, the only way to create something real out of the situation they had been thrust into. She began testing the boundaries carefully, in small ways that could be easily dismissed if they were not well received. She started asking more personal questions during their evening meals, inquiring about his childhood and his parents, and the years before he became king. She offered her own stories in return, sharing memories of her time with Marin, describing the plants she had loved most, and the satisfaction of creating remedies that actually worked. She reached out occasionally to touch his hand or his arm, brief contacts that could be interpreted as accidental, watching to see how he responded. And slowly, gradually, she began to sense a shift, a fractional lowering of his defenses, a growing willingness to engage with her on a more personal level. One evening, nearly 2 months after the claiming ceremony, they were sitting by the fireplace after dinner, the room warm and quiet, the palace settling into its nighttime rhythms. Aldrich had been telling her about a dispute between two noble houses over a contested border, his frustration evident in his voice. And Alara had listened and offered suggestions drawn from her experience mediating arguments between villagers in her former life. Her suggestion had been simple, almost obvious in its logic, but Aldrich had looked at her with something like wonder, as though she had revealed some profound truth he had been unable to see on his own. "How do you do that?" he asked. "How do you cut through all the complexity and see so clearly to the heart of the issue?" Alara shrugged, uncertain how to answer. "I suppose I learned from Marin. She always said that people made things more complicated than they needed to be, that most problems had simple solutions if you were willing to look past your own assumptions and really listen to what was being said. I wish I had known her," Aldrich said quietly. "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was. She saved me in more ways than one. I do not know what would have become of me if she had not taken me on as an apprentice, if she had not shown me that I could be something other than what everyone else told me I was." "And what did everyone else tell you that you were?" Alara hesitated, the old shame rising up in her throat, the familiar litany of worthless and cursed and invisible. But she pushed past it, forcing herself to speak the truth aloud. "Nothing. They told me I was nothing, a burden, a mistake, someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps she was given and never ask for more." Aldrich was silent for a long moment, his expression darkening with something that looked like anger, though she did not think it was directed at her. "They were wrong," he said finally, his voice low and fierce. "You are not nothing. You are intelligent and observant and stronger than you realize. You are learning faster than anyone I have ever seen, adapting to this world that is so foreign to everything you have known, holding your own against people who would be happy to see you fail. You are extraordinary, Alara, and I am sorry that no one told you that before now." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs, bringing tears to her eyes that she could not quite blink away. She had not realized how much she needed to hear something like that, how much she had been starving for recognition of her worth, for acknowledgement that she was more than the sum of her circumstances. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have no idea what that means to me." Aldrich reached out and touched her face, his fingers gentle as they brushed away the tears that had escaped down her cheeks. "You deserve to be seen," he said quietly. "You deserve to be valued. And I am sorry that I have been so focused on maintaining distance that I have failed to show you that I recognize what you are doing, how hard you are working, how much you have accomplished in such a short time. You were trying to protect yourself," Alara said, understanding even as her heart ached. "I do not blame you for that. I know what you lost. I know why you are afraid to care for anyone again." "I am afraid," Aldrich admitted, the words clearly difficult for him to say. "I am afraid of what it would do to me if something happened to you, if I allowed myself to care and then lost you the way I lost them. But I am also beginning to realize that trying to keep you at a distance is its own kind of torture, that denying the bond between us is not actually protecting me from anything except the possibility of happiness." He moved closer, his hand still on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her heart stutter. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I do not know how to let someone in after spending so many years keeping everyone out. But I would like to try, if you are willing. I would like to see what we could build together, what this bond could become if we stopped fighting it and started embracing it." Alara could not speak past the emotion clogging her throat, so instead, she simply nodded, closing the distance between them, pressing her forehead against his in a gesture that felt both intimate and sacred. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for the first time since the claiming ceremony, she felt the full force of the bond settling into place, recognizing that they were finally choosing each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because the connection between them was real and worth fighting for, and worth the risk of potential pain. The shift in their relationship was subtle, but unmistakable. Aldrich still maintained his public reserve, still presented the image of the cold and distant king when they were in court or at formal events. But in private, he began to let his guard down in ways that revealed the man beneath the crown. He told her stories about his childhood, about his parents who had ruled with wisdom and compassion, about his younger sister Mira, who had been bright and fearless, and only 12 years old when she died. He spoke about the night of the fire, the way he had been away from the palace on a hunting trip, the messenger who had ridden through the night to bring him the news, the absolute devastation of returning to find his entire family gone, and the investigation yielding nothing but dead ends and suspicions without proof. He told her about the years that followed, the weight of ruling alone, the constant vigilance required to maintain power when there were those who saw his grief as weakness, his youth as vulnerability. Alara listened to all of it, holding the pieces of his pain with careful hands, offering comfort not through empty platitudes, but through presence, through the simple act of witnessing his grief without trying to fix it or minimize it. She shared her own losses in return, the mother she had never known, the father who had abandoned her before she was born, the years of feeling fundamentally unwanted by a world that had no place for girls like her. They built a bridge between them, constructed from shared wounds and mutual understanding, and slowly the space that had separated them in their bed began to close, until they fell asleep each night with her head on his chest and his arms wrapped around her, the bond between them settling into something that felt less like a chain and more like a choice. The court noticed, of course. It was impossible to hide the way Aldrich looked at her now, the subtle protectiveness in his posture when he stood beside her, the way his hand found hers in moments of stress or uncertainty. Some of the nobles who had been openly dismissive began to temper their hostility, recognizing that she was not going to disappear, that the king's attachment to her was deepening rather than fading, that opposing her might mean losing Aldrich's favor. Others, particularly those in Maelor's circle, became more entrenched in their resistance, their whispers growing more pointed, their attempts at undermining her more sophisticated. Alara continued her lessons and her training, but she also began to carve out a role for herself that went beyond simply being the king's mate. She started working with the palace healers, offering her knowledge of herbs and remedies, teaching them techniques Maren had passed down to her. She established a small garden in one of the palace courtyards where she could grow medicinal plants, spending hours there with her hands in the soil, finding peace in the familiar work. She began accompanying Lady Sanna on visits to the poorer quarters of the city, seeing firsthand the conditions in which many of Solmir's citizens lived, understanding that the palace existed in a bubble of wealth and comfort that bore no resemblance to the reality of life for most people in the kingdom. These visits troubled her deeply, bringing back memories of her own poverty, her own hunger, her own vulnerability. She spoke to Aldrich about it one evening, describing the overcrowded tenements and the children with hollowed cheeks, and the old people who could not afford the medicine they needed. She told him that the wealth of the palace could feed hundreds of families, that the cost of a single diplomatic reception could provide clean water to an entire neighborhood, that the kingdom's resources were so unevenly distributed that some lived in luxury while others starved in the shadows. Aldrich listened with a frown of concentration, and then he asked what she proposed they do about it. Alara had not expected the question, had assumed he would dismiss her observations as naive or impractical, and she stumbled over her words as she tried to articulate thoughts she had not fully formed. But Aldrich was patient, asking questions that helped her clarify her ideas, pushing her to think through the practical implications of her suggestions. They spent hours that night discussing possible reforms, ways to redistribute resources without destabilizing the economy, programs that could provide basic necessities to the poorest citizens, changes to tax policy that would require the nobility to contribute more to the common good. By the end of the conversation, Aldrich had agreed to implement several of her suggestions on a trial basis, to allocate funds for a public health initiative that would provide free medical care in the poorest districts, to establish distribution centers where families could receive food and basic supplies. He told her that she could oversee the program if she wished, that it would give her a clear purpose within the court and demonstrate to the nobles that she was more than simply decorative. Alara accepted eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to do something meaningful, to use her position to actually help people rather than just playing the role of queen. The announcement of the initiative was met with mixed reactions. Some of the nobles supported it, recognizing that a healthier, better-fed population would be more productive and less likely to rebel. Others saw it as a waste of resources, an unnecessary concession to people who should simply work harder if they wanted better lives. Mailer was among the most vocal opponents, arguing in council meetings that the program would create dependency, that it would encourage laziness and entitlement, that it set a dangerous precedent of the crown interfering in matters that should be left to individual responsibility. Aldrich overruled him, but the conflict between them intensified, the political divide growing wider with each passing week. Alara threw herself into the work with the same determination she had brought to everything else. She worked with the palace healers to develop treatment protocols, trained volunteers who would staff the distribution centers, visited the sites where the programs were being implemented to ensure they were running properly. She spent long hours in the poorer districts, often with Lady Santa at her side, meeting the people who would benefit from the initiative, listening to their stories, understanding their needs. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining in ways that her court training had never been, but it felt right in a way that nothing else had since she arrived at the palace. This was work that mattered, work that made a real difference in people's lives, and she found a deep satisfaction in it that sustained her through the long days and the opposition from the court. 3 months after the initiative launched, Alara received word that there had been an outbreak of fever in one of the eastern districts, dozens of people falling ill within days of each other. The palace healers were overwhelmed, unable to keep up with the number of patients, and Alara made the decision to go herself, to use her knowledge of herbal remedies to treat those who could not access the limited supply of conventional medicines. Aldrich objected when she told him, arguing that it was too dangerous, that she could become infected, that she should send others to handle it rather than putting herself at risk. But Alara was adamant, pointing out that she had spent years working with Marin treating illnesses just like this, that she knew what she was doing, that she could not ask others to do work she was not willing to do herself. They argued about it for over an hour, voices rising in a way that was unprecedented in their relationship, until finally Aldrich conceded with the condition that she take guards with her and return to the palace each night rather than staying in the infected district. Alara agreed, and the next morning she set out with Captain Roth and a contingent of guards, carrying supplies of herbs and tinctures she had prepared in her garden. The situation in the district was worse than she had anticipated. The fever was spreading rapidly, affecting primarily children and the elderly, those whose bodies were already weakened by malnutrition and poor living conditions. Alara worked from dawn until well past dark, moving from house to house, brewing remedies, treating symptoms, sitting with the dying when there was nothing more she could do. She saw suffering that reminded her viscerally of her own childhood, the desperation of parents who could not afford to save their children, the resignation of old people who had lived hard lives and were ready for them to end. It broke something open in her chest, all the grief she had carried for years but never had time to process, all the anger at the injustice of a world that allowed some to have everything while others had nothing. She worked for 6 days straight, sleeping only a few hours each night before returning to the district at first light. The palace healers joined her on the 3rd day, and together they managed to contain the outbreak, to treat the majority of cases before they became fatal. When it was finally over, when the last patient had recovered or died and the district was declared safe again, Alara returned to the palace covered in sweat and grime and exhaustion so profound she could barely stand. Aldrich met her at the entrance to their rooms, and the moment she saw him, the moment she was finally in a space where she did not have to be strong for anyone else, she broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs she could not control. all the emotion she had been holding back for days pouring out in a flood that left her gasping for breath. Aldrich held her through it, his arms tight around her, his voice murmuring words of comfort she could not quite hear over the sound of her own crying. He helped her to the bathing room and stayed with her while she washed away the evidence of the past week. And then he put her to bed and climbed in beside her, holding her until the crying finally subsided and exhaustion dragged her under into dreamless sleep. She woke nearly 20 hours later to find Aldrich sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He told her that word of what she had done had spread through the city, that people were calling her the Healer Queen, that her actions had earned her a level of public support and affection that most monarchs spent lifetimes trying to achieve. He told her that he was proud of her, that he was also terrified by how close she had come to serious illness or death, that he understood now what it meant to care for someone so much that their safety became more important than his own comfort. "I love you," he said quietly, the words simple but weighted with meaning. "I did not think I was capable of it anymore, did not think I would ever allow myself to feel this way about anyone again. But I love you, Alara. Not because fate chose you for me, not because of the bond between us, but because of who you are, the strength and compassion and fierce determination you bring to everything you do. I love you, and I am asking you to be careful, to not throw yourself into danger without considering what it would do to me if I lost you." Alara reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I love you too," she said, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I have for weeks now, maybe longer. I am sorry I frightened you. I did not fully understand what it would feel like for you to worry, to not know if I would come back safe. But I cannot stop doing this work, Aldrich. I cannot turn away from people who need help just because it might be dangerous. That is not who I am." "I know," Aldrich said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "I know, and I would not ask you to stop. I am only asking you to be more careful, to take precautions, to remember that you are important not just to the people in those districts, but to me, to this kingdom, to the future we are trying to build together." They spent the rest of the day in their rooms, talking and resting and simply being together, the bond between them stronger now for having weathered this test. And when they finally emerged that evening to attend a council meeting, they presented a united front that was impossible to miss. Aldrich's hand on the small of Alara's back, a clear statement of partnership, of mutual support, of a relationship that had moved far beyond the transactional claiming of the ceremony. But if Alara had earned support from the common people and from some of the nobility, she had also solidified Maelor's enmity into something approaching hatred. He saw her growing influence as a direct threat to his own power, saw the love between her and Aldrich as a weakness he could exploit, saw an opportunity to strike at the king through the woman he cared for, and he began to plan, carefully and methodically, laying the groundwork for a move that would either destroy Alara completely or give him the leverage he needed to challenge Aldrich's rule. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 weeks later, when Alara began feeling ill. It started with mild nausea and fatigue, symptoms she initially attributed to overwork and stress. But as days passed, the symptoms intensified, her stomach cramping painfully after meals, her energy draining away until she could barely get through her daily activities. The palace healers examined her and found nothing obviously wrong, no fever or infection or injury that could explain her condition. They prescribed rest and bland foods, suggesting that perhaps she had picked up some lingering illness from her time in the infected district. But Alara knew her own body, knew the properties of plants and poisons, and something about the progression of her symptoms felt wrong, felt deliberate. She began paying attention to what she ate, and when the symptoms worsened, and she realized that she always felt worse after drinking the tea that was brought to her room each morning. A special blend that one of the attendants had suggested would help settle her stomach. She tested the theory by pouring out the tea and pretending to drink it, and the symptoms did not appear that day. The next morning, she drank the tea again, and within an hour, she was doubled over with cramps so severe she could barely breathe. Poison. Someone was poisoning her, slowly and carefully, in doses calculated to cause suffering without being immediately fatal. Alara felt a cold fury settle over her, cutting through the pain, sharpening her mind into focus. She needed proof, needed to identify the substance being used and trace it back to its source. She collected the dregs from the bottom of the teacup and took them to her garden, using her knowledge of chemistry and her experience with medicinal compounds to analyze what she found. It took her most of the day, but she finally identified the poison, a derivative of wolfsbane, carefully prepared to be absorbed slowly, causing gradual organ damage that would eventually prove fatal if left untreated. She prepared an antidote using plants from her garden, dosing herself carefully and waiting to see if the symptoms improved. Within hours, she felt better, the cramping subsiding, her energy beginning to return. She had confirmed both the poison and the cure, but she still did not know who was responsible or how to prove it. She could not simply accuse someone without evidence, could not raise an alarm that would alert the poisoner that she had discovered their plan. She needed to be smart about this, needed to gather information before making her move. She confided in Lady Sanna first, trusting the older woman's wisdom and discretion. Lady Sanna was horrified but not surprised, confirming Alara's suspicion that this had Maelor's signature on it, the careful methodology and calculated cruelty characteristic of his approach to removing obstacles. Together, they devised a plan. Alara would continue pretending to drink the poison tea, would continue to appear weak and ill, while secretly taking the antidote to counteract the effects. Meanwhile, Lady Sanna would work to identify which of the attendants was delivering the tea, who had access to Alara's rooms, who might be acting on Maelor's orders. It took 2 weeks of careful observation and discreet questioning, but they finally identified the source. A young beta woman named Sira, who had joined the palace staff only a month ago, recommended by one of Maelor's trusted servants, positioned specifically to have access to Alara's private spaces. Lady Sanna watched Sira closely, observed her meeting with one of Maelor's men in a secluded courtyard, receiving a small vial that she then carried back to the servants' quarters. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, enough to raise serious questions about Maelor's involvement. Alara knew she needed to act quickly, before Maelor realized his plan was not working, before he escalated to something more direct and immediate. She went to Aldrich and laid out everything she had discovered, showing him the analysis of the poison, explaining the pattern of her symptoms, presenting the evidence of Sira's connection to Maelor. Aldrich's reaction was volcanic, his fury so intense that Alara actually stepped back, momentarily afraid of the violence radiating from him. But his anger was not directed at her. It was directed at Maelor, at the man who had dared to harm what was his, who had dared to put her life in danger. "I will kill him," Aldrich said, his voice deadly quiet. "I will execute him for treason and attempted murder, and I will do it publicly so that everyone understands what happens to those who threaten you." "No," Alara said firmly, her hand on his arm, grounding him. "That is exactly what he wants. He wants you to act emotionally, to move against him without following proper legal procedure, to give him grounds to claim that you are unfit to rule, that you allow personal feelings to override justice. We need to be smarter than that. We need to build a case so strong that even his allies cannot defend him. We need to expose him in a way that leaves no doubt of his guilt." Aldrich struggled visibly with his instinct to simply eliminate the threat, but he trusted her judgment enough to listen to her plan. They would continue the charade for a few more days, allowing Maelor to believe his plan was working, giving them time to gather more evidence. They would have Sira arrested and questioned, using her testimony to directly implicate Maelor. And they would present all of this to the full council in a formal hearing, where Maelor could be held accountable under the law, where his guilt could be established beyond any reasonable doubt. The plan was executed perfectly. Sira was arrested quietly in the middle of the night, brought before Aldrich and his most trusted advisors, confronted with the evidence of her role in the poisoning. She broke quickly, admitting that Maelor had recruited her, had given her the poison and specific instructions on how to administer it, had promised her a substantial reward if she succeeded in killing Alara without getting caught. Her confession was recorded by the royal scribe, witnessed by multiple officials, legally binding and irrefutable. The formal hearing was convened 3 days later. Every member of the council in attendance, the chamber filled with nobles and officials who sensed that something significant was about to happen. Aldrich presented the evidence methodically, starting with Olara's symptoms and her analysis of the poison, moving through the investigation that had identified Sira, culminating in Sira's full confession and her explicit naming of Maelor as the architect of the plot. The silence in the chamber was absolute as the testimony was read aloud, the weight of the accusations settling over everyone present like a suffocating blanket. Maelor denied everything, of course, claiming that Sira was lying, that she had been coerced or bribed to make false accusations, that this was a conspiracy to remove him from power because he had dared to question Olara's suitability as queen. But his denials rang hollow against the mountain of evidence, and even his closest allies began to distance themselves, recognizing that defending him now would be political suicide. The council voted unanimously to strip him of his titles and position, to confiscate his lands and assets, to exile him from Astralis permanently. Aldrich wanted execution, but Olara argued for mercy, pointing out that exile was a fate worse than death for a man like Maelor, that forcing him to live with his failure would be more painful than ending his life cleanly. Aldrich agreed reluctantly, and Maelor was escorted from the palace that same day, his belongings seized, his network of supporters scattered, his power completely broken. Olara watched him go from a window in the council chamber, feeling not triumph, but a deep exhaustion. The knowledge that she had just made an enemy who would spend the rest of his life plotting revenge, who would never forgive her for surviving his attempt to destroy her. But she had survived. She had recognized the threat, had gathered evidence, had outmaneuvered someone far more experienced in court intrigue, and she had done it while maintaining her integrity, while refusing to stoop to his level of cruelty. It was a victory, even if it did not feel like one, even if it came with the knowledge that there would be other threats, other challenges, other people who would see her as a weakness to exploit or an obstacle to remove. The weeks following Maelor's exile were strange, the palace settling into a new equilibrium. The balance of power shifted by his absence. Some of his former allies approached Olara cautiously, seeking to make peace, to demonstrate that they had not supported his actions, to position themselves favorably with the woman who had proven herself both intelligent and dangerous. Olara accepted their overtures with careful diplomacy, making no promises but leaving doors open, understanding that building alliances was essential even with people she did not entirely trust. Her public health initiatives continued to expand, the success of the initial programs leading to additional funding and broader implementation. She established training programs for community healers, created supply chains for distributing medicines to remote villages, worked with Master Davran to reform tax policies in ways that provided better support for the kingdom's poorest citizens. The work consumed her, gave her purpose beyond simply being Aldrich's mate, established her as a force in her own right within the kingdom's governance. And through it all, her relationship with Aldrich deepened into something that felt solid and real and lasting. They were partners now in the truest sense, working together to rule the kingdom, supporting each other through challenges and celebrating each other's victories, building a life that was richer and more fulfilling than either of them had imagined possible. The bond between them had become something beyond fate, something they had chosen and nurtured and fought to protect, and it made them stronger together than either could have been alone.